Hi, everyone. I'm Jeremy Schott, the director of the Medieval Studies Institute here at IU. Um, Before we get started, I have a note on sound for people who are listening via Zoom. We're having to switch microphones as we switch speakers as we move to different parts of the program. So if you hear a slight pause as we adjust the audio, that's normal. Just bear with us. So I'm very pleased that we're finally able to be here together to learn about Kassia. Despite having to cancel last semester and the current Omicron situation, we're happy to have at least the ability to have some of you here in person, and I'm glad that we're able to present the live stream so that more people can participate. I was skimming through Kassia's secular poetry the other day and found some lines that were pertinent for the kinds of compromises we've had to make putting together live events. So if you'll bear with my poor Greek pronunciation for a minute. Krison monisis tis kakis sunusias, krison kainasos tis kakis evektsias, krison asthenin I kakos hygienin, which is very loosely translated, solitude's better than bad company, and disease bests poor health habits, but a little suffering is better than being a hygienic bore. So our hybrid events, an attempt to take safety seriously while still having an opportunity to enjoy some of the more elevated things for which it's worth staying healthy in the first place. I'd also like to take a minute to remind folks of some other upcoming medieval studies events. March 25th through 26th, this year we're happy to be hosting our annual Medieval Studies Symposium once again, hosted by our Graduate Student Association. And we'll also be holding our regular Medivalia at the Lily event this year. It will be virtual, but it will be on March 1st, and our speaker will be Professor Eric Johnson of Ohio State. Before introducing the speakers for the event, I'd like to thank those who helped make the event possible. Nicolo Sassi, our Medieval Studies Assistant, Emily Clark, our Medieval Studies Communications Assistant, and Linnea Holt from the Gail Karch Cook Center for Public Arts and Humanities and Maxwell Hall, whose help was critical in preparing the venue and the tech for our presentation. Noah Argermon for his help with sound and tech. You can tell I'm calling everything I don't understand tech. A lot of people have helped pivot this to a hybrid event in the course of a week. And Dr. Kalani Craig, the Associate Director of Medieval Studies, for handling the lion's share of the logistics for the event. Our presenters today are both experts in historical performance. Brett Umlauf is a graduate student in the Historical Performance Department at Jacobs School. She's also in her first year of Byzantine chant studies at Dramas Conservatory in Greece, and a member of the St. Anicia All-Women's Byzantine Choir of Thessaloniki. Brett's currently developing a project entitled Hazelnut Road, Vows of Stability, Acts of Mobility, a long-form travel performance project about women religious artists from 9th century Byzantium to 17th century Peru. She's planning to do work in Greece and Turkey this fall to begin researching and field work with Byzantine chanters and monastic women, and collaborations with artists rediscovering Kassia. Dr. Alexander Lingus is professor of music at City University of London and the founder and music director of the vocal ensemble Capella Romana. He's also a fellow of the University of Oxford's European Humanities Research Center. His many publications include articles for the Oxford Companion to Music, the New Grove Dictionary of Music and Musicians, and the Oxford Handbook of Byzantine Studies. He's currently working on a study of Sunday Matins in the Rite of Hagia Sophia for Ashgate and a historical introduction to Byzantine chant for Yale University Press. I'd encourage everyone to take a look at Capella Romana's website, where you can find some excellent material on Byzantine music and information about the group's recordings. Again, thank you all for coming, and please enjoy the presentation.
Maybe the attendees would like to do the drum. Good evening and welcome everyone, and thank you for that wonderful performance just now of the drone. Thank you, Dr. Schott and the Medieval Studies Institute for inviting us, and thank you all for joining us tonight to celebrate Kassia. I opened tonight's program with a sacred medieval chant. It was not written by Kassia, however, but by another abbess whose name and works are more familiar to many of us, the 12th century composer Hildegard of Bingen. I might have guessed Hildegard was the earliest woman composer with extant works, until one day when I noticed the first entry in a reference work on women composers was not Hildegard, but Kassia. Who was this nun composer from Constantinople who led her own monastery 1,500 miles southeast of Hildegard's Abbey on the Rhine, and over 300 years earlier? I was eager to sing her music, but intimidated. Accessing Kassia seemed more difficult than accessing Hildegard. Kassia's hymns are in medieval Greek, not a language of focus at a Western art music conservatory. Her music is transmitted through a different notation system without a staff, in symbols called neumes, written above the text, as you see here. Also, there is the perilous assumption that Hildegard is someone of our tradition, and Kassia is of an arbitrary division of civilizations that keeps this East Roman hymnographer out of scope at our conservatories and on our concert stages. In truth, there are daunting barriers to making sense of both Hildegard's and Kassia's works. Medieval liturgical music was primarily an oral tradition, taught and retained through the memories of participants. Since we have no audio recordings from the 9th or 12th centuries, we must turn instead to the recording technology of texts as a means to understanding how the music sounded. While the sound of the medieval voice is elusive, the melodies it sang can seem more tangible. But both Kassia's and Hildegard's works are actually heavily mediated before the performer begins to devise their own interpretation. The music's mediators include the manuscript source's scribal hand preserving an oral tradition, the scholar's hand distilling much relied upon modern transcriptions of the manuscripts, the performer's interpretation in concert and audio recordings subject to imitation to the point of uniformity, and the practitioners of a living tradition and its own changes over time. Here is an early manuscript source of Kassia's music, and here is an early source of Hildegard's music that I sang for you just now. You can see the early German neumes that indicate the melody for Hildegard's poem. But even though we can discern the lines of a staff, which feels familiar, most of us will find the neumes of this old notation system unrecognizable or too time-consuming to decipher. So we rely on transcriptions, such as this one by Dr. Beverly Lomer. Lomer has given us our starting pitch and transcribed the intervals of Hildegard's melody, but she prescribes no rhythm, using note heads of equal duration instead. She leaves it up to us to devise the rhythm from textual clues, such as accented syllables, from our research beyond the edition, from the theories of our teachers, conventions in the discography, or our own subjective intuition or creativity. Most of the neumes meanings are understood, but neumes without scholarly consensus as to their meaning, like for example the quilisma, are also ours to interpret. If we were writing a musicological article, we could theorize about all the different ways to interpret Hildegard's quilisma, for example. But when we sing that neume in performance, we get just the one choice. The performer must decide which expertise to trust and incorporate that quilisma into their own expressive palette. Lomer writes it with a slur so that we'll sing the gesture in one breath. So, here's the quilisma. But should I re-articulate the repeated note? Is it a shudder, as one theorist claimed? And what does that mean? Is there a short trill, a pulsation, or vibrato, as some scholars believe? Should we fill in pitches between the notes, as others believe? Or is there a mordant or turn in between, as still others believe? Should we hold one note longer? Should one note be louder? Should we sing the first quilisma the same as the next? Or does the ornament's context destabilize its meaning? Or should we just ignore it, as many performers have, and let uncertainty trump creativity? Any musical score, even the most prescriptive contemporary piece, is missing data. The performer is always a co-inventor to some degree. We can never expect medieval notation to encompass all the unwritten conventions that guided medieval singers. And the more mediation between the early manuscript sources and the performer, the more essential the meta-expertise to choose good guidance for devising a convincing performance. While Hildegard's works were never adopted into the liturgical canon, Kassia's were. For Kassia's music, we have the benefit and challenge of consulting a thriving, living tradition. Byzantine music in the Orthodox Church has no shortage of different schools of thought regarding interpretations of the medieval melodies. Performers can therefore combine an ethnomusicological investigation with careful analysis of the written sources and appreciate another mode of access to Kassia's music. It is my honor now to hand the floor to an expert in both approaches, Dr. Lingus, who will introduce you to the star of this evening, Kassia, and the historical and received traditions through which she is transmitted to us. Thank you.
Thank you, and my great thanks also to the organizers of this wonderful event for their endurance and perseverance in making it happen. So in this, my first contribution to our joint presentation, I will offer some additional background to help you understand how historical research and living tradition, both just mentioned by my colleague here, bear upon the study of Byzantine chant. I will begin by defining some key terms and concepts. So first of all, the term we generally hear today is Byzantine or Byzantine music or chant. However, it has other names. Traditional names are psalmodia, which means psalmody, ecclesiastiki musiki, or ecclesiastical music, or melos, the psaltic art, the art of the cantor, and then only in fairly recent years, Byzantine chant. A lot of that has to do also with the fact that the empire that we call Byzantium never called itself that. They called itself Rome. There was the Roman Empire. So what we're talking about, though, is the major Eastern sibling of the Latin chant of the Roman Rite. And like the Byzantine Rite itself, which we'll talk a little bit more about how it came together later on, the chant tradition is in some ways a kind of a mongrel. This is the word used by an eminent liturgiologist, with roots in the Eastern Mediterranean's urban and monastic traditions of Christian worship, especially those centered on Constantinople and Jerusalem. So here's the Eastern Roman Empire at its geographic apogee, following Justinian's reconquest of a substantial portion of its former western provinces. This is after the fall of Rome. The Roman Empire gets Rome back. This is the era of the building of the still extant Cathedral of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, now once again a functioning mosque in modern Istanbul. For the era of Kassia, we fast forward to a time when the Eastern Roman Empire had shrunk once again, and it had an ideological rival with a Frankish king who got himself crowned Roman emperor, Charlemagne. However, the Eastern Roman Empire at this point was entering into a new period of expansion, actually expanded quite a bit over the next few centuries, through the 11th centuries. And this was also, they're coming out of a time of internal and external troubles, including the Muslim Arab conquest of the 7th century, when they lost North Africa and all the Middle Eastern provinces, and also intense theological disputes over the use of icons. Kassia lived towards the end of that. And it is also, significantly for us, since we're talking about music, the period that two hybrid liturgical systems with their music, chant, were being disseminated in the eastern and former western parts of the Roman Empire, respectively, so-called Byzantine chant in the Greek East and Franco-Roman or Gregorian chant in the West. So let's go to the East now. So Byzantine chant, we can talk about a number of periods. There are different ways of slicing it up, but we can speak on the one hand of origins in late antiquity, from the period to when Christianity becomes the legal and then the official state religion of the Roman Empire, essentially to the time of the Muslim conquests. The medieval period, we'll call it, up to the Ottoman conquest, the fall of Constantinople of 1453. We can speak also of a post-Byzantine period. And then also, in that later period, we can distinguish also a period of the new method, where there was a notational reform at the beginning of the 19th century that created the system that's now in use today from Moldavia to the Middle East. So if you sing Eastern Orthodox Christian services in Greek, Romanian, Albanian, you name it, Arabic, and you could be in Jerusalem or Sinai or Yash, you would use this reformed system, which is based on the medieval system. So Brett very nicely pointed out that written witnesses are what we have when we don't have sound recordings. There are also things like buildings, architecture, there are all sorts of other things as well, but it's especially the written sources from which we can say something about the music and attempt to perform it, the music of the Middle Ages. So as Brett also mentioned, Byzantine chant is an historical phenomenon and a living tradition. It is one that is very literate. There are pieces that were created that probably could only have been created with the aid of notation. But then also, if you go through the villages of Eastern Europe, you will find people that in Greek are called praktiki, practical singers, practical chanters, people who have learned the repertory exclusively by ear. And that remains essentially the practice of some other Eastern Christian churches, like the Copts of Egypt. They don't use notation at all. The Ethiopians use it a little bit, but it doesn't tell you much that you don't already know from spending 5 years of apprenticeship to learn it. The earliest notated manuscripts come from the 9th or somewhere around the 9th, 10th centuries, and it becomes readable in a sense that it gives us enough information about the sequence of notes, of musical pitches, in the later 12th century. And you can see this process coming out in charts like this one here, which is a comparative chart by the scholar Constantine Floros, where he shows some very early manuscripts at the top where only every third or fourth syllable may have a little sign over it. And then down to a point a little further down where he's able to provide a transcription into staff notation. That's the point where it becomes diastematic. It shows the musical intervals. And that's the system that scholars have taken to calling in English Middle Byzantine notation. And, in fact, there's a nice handy guide to this, current guide, by my friend and colleague Christian Trulsgaard. So, what do manuscripts of chant in Middle Byzantine notation, when read in the light of treatises, other sorts of information that we have, not tell us? They tell us, Here are some things, important things. This follows up with what Brett was saying. They don't tell us what the absolute pitch was. There is no pitch standard. You can sing it, and this remains true of Byzantine chant today. You can sing it wherever it is convenient for your voice. Doesn't tell you, the old notation doesn't tell you how the scales are tuned precisely. It doesn't tell you when to add sharps and flats, what we would call in Western music, adding small inflections of the notes. It doesn't tell you subdivisions of the basic beat. So if the basic beat is da, 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 the old notation can show you da, 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 show you lengthenings, but it can't show you da, 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 or da, 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 or any subdivision of that basic beat. So you have to learn it from context. And it doesn't tell you precisely how to realize some signs that are qualitative. There are multiple different ways of writing how to go up a step. Some of them with some sort of an accent, some of them with tossing your voice, all sorts of things. Those were the things that you, by and large, had to learn from your teacher. And vocal timbre, the type of vocal style, the difference between, sort of operatic or or whatever it happens to be. That's not indicated either. And tempo. How fast or slow. No metronomes. So, in terms of how to approach these sources, there is a spectrum of opinion. When you have people who've learned it by ear and a long manuscript tradition, and the music being continuing in use, there's no point with Byzantine chant like we have with Gregorian chant, which happened in the 19th century, where a bunch of scholars said, we want to go back to the earliest possible manuscripts to come up with the authentic chant. The Gregorian chant we normally hear today is a product of a scholarly restoration, they called it, led by the monks of the French Abbey of Solesmes. Instead, what we have is a truly continuous tradition with occasional reshufflings. So, on the one end of the spectrum, we have might call conservative or traditionalists. At the extreme level, they would say reliable history begins with the earliest sound recordings, especially those of leading cantors of the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople, who faithfully represent musical traditions that at their core have changed little over time. The authority of the teacher is made central. A more mainstream opinion would be the transcriptions that were made from the medieval notation, from Middle Byzantine notation, into the new method at the beginning of the 19th century. And the new method does show you rhythmic subdivision, sharps and flats, and all sorts of other things. That this reveals in full the shape of melodies that were only often reproduced stenographically, in shorthand, in the old notation. What do I mean by that? On the left is a 15th century manuscript, beginning of Psalm 140 from Vespers in Mode 1. And if you read the notes, sort of what you see is what you get, just read the pitches written, you get something like this. Kyrie ekraksa prosei. That takes me through the first word and 2 words in a bit, or 3 words in a bit. Kyrie, let's just take the first word in how it was transcribed at the beginning of the 19th century, this same melody. That's the first word. Second word. And I was adding even more notes than actually are written there too, a few minor ornaments, the sort of things I learned from my teacher. So, stenographic indeed. There's another view that's out there, that Middle Byzantine notation had a shifting relationship with oral tradition. But during the Middle Ages, it was fundamentally what you see is what you get, like I sang the first thing. And actually, the way I sang the first one is about how long the modern version of that melody takes. It's actually used in services. Its interpretation thus offers similar challenges to those familiar from the study of performance of pre-modern Western music. You have to make some decisions about sharps and flats and rhythm. Now, one thing to note, however, also is that older mainstream scholarship, especially as led by Western scholars, that is non-Greeks and non-Eastern Europeans, for whom it's not a native tradition somehow, they also saw that anything that happened after 1453, or in some cases even after about 1300, as being overwhelmed by Oriental influence, meaning bad. That's why I say devolutionary view. So this, for example, was the perspective of the founders of the main flagship organization that investigated Byzantine chant. Started off in the 1930s, the Monumenta Musicae Byzantinae, founded by the Egon Welles, Karsten Höeg, and Henry Tilliard, and they came up with a system for transcribing Middle Byzantine notation that ended up reproducing something very much like Gregorian chant, as it had recently been restored. Christos genate doxa sate, Christos ex uranon. And we're in a comfortable world of Gregorian chant, as we kind of know and love it. In this edition, they even helpfully provided a Latin translation, so you can sort of do the full thing. However, but that tells you how much things like timbre and ornamentation and the like, the difference it makes, and rhythm. Another viewpoint that is now really probably the emerging musicological consensus since the 1970s, though it was foreshadowed by a few scholars as early as the beginning of the 20th century, like Marcos Vasiliou, was that musical change is a natural phenomenon and morally neutral. So it's not devolution, corruption, or anything, but just the system. Music has changed over time. And questions of musical continuity must therefore be addressed on a case-by-case basis. So Vasiliou, who was an official of the Patriarchate in Constantinople in the beginning of the 20th century, he published transcriptions in the modern chant notation system and in staff notation from the old chant that were very much what you see is what you get. Just sort of pretty much one-to-one relationship, not a little formula as stenography for something much bigger. And this is the approach that has been adopted by Ioannis Arvanitis. Dr. Arvanitis did a 2-volume doctoral thesis on rhythm in medieval Byzantine chant, and he is the person who has worked most closely with Capella Romana on our editions. And he has, so the same chant that I sang for you before, Christos genate, and so on, in his version from a slightly different manuscript, so a few melodic differences. Christos genate doxa sate, Christos ex uranon. Whole different feel when you have with the rhythm and so on, which is actually, and you add the type of vocal performance practice that modern received cantors are trained with, and you get something much more stylistically compatible with music that's actually sung in the Greek Orthodox Church today, although the cantors would recognize that, well, this isn't our modern melody. Christos genate doxa sate is the modern melody. But there's some cases when you do what you see is what you get, where the melodies are about the same. On the left is a 13th century manuscript, now in St. Petersburg, showing the beginning of St. Romanus the Melodist, 6th century composer. The prologue of his great hymn for Christmas, Today the Virgin Gives Birth, and it was rarely written down because it was done, the tune was used so frequently. But anyway, the version that somebody wrote down in a 13th century manuscript is Anes hypathenos imeron toni perusion Parthenos, and so on. 19th century Constantinople. I Parthenos imeron toni perusion dicti. Essentially the same tune. And it works out all through all the phrases. So Kassia. How does Kassia fare in all of this? So our 9th century composer from Constantinople. Well, one of the first major musicological studies of her by Henry Tilliard, one of the founders of the Monumenta, he was very interesting in that he actually did approach the received tradition. He studied with a Greek cantor, a slightly eccentric one actually in Athens, but be that as it may, he even published some modern received versions of her music, and then also came up with his own transcriptions, which were influenced by the theories of Hugo Riemann. If there are any music theorists out there, you probably didn't know he did Byzantine musicology, but he did, and came up with some very strange attempts to reconcile the music of the medieval Roman Empire with ancient Greek music, and came up with very elaborate theories of scales and rhythms, which were then later abandoned. The versions that circulate most widely are those of the Monumenta Musicae Byzantinae itself. Here's Egon Velis, his free rhythm transcription of a hymn by Kassia. And so on. And that's in fact what one finds in probably one of the anthologies that Brett saw earlier, that this system was then, it was taught to me, that was the current thing too, and it was taught to Diane Touliatos, and she used it for her publications as well, so it's a kind of Gregorianizing system. She later revised it to try to add a few more twiddly bits in some of her later editions of this, but fundamentally it's still the system of the Monumenta. And I believe you will be hearing a little bit later some excerpts of our colleague Dr. Yannis Arvanitis' transcription of this same hymn with much more definite rhythms and some other perspectives on ornamentation. But there's the same hymn. So, of course, Kassia's music has had a very long history. It didn't stop with a 14th century manuscript like this. So a little bit later we'll see what happened next. But at this stage I will turn it over to my colleague.
Thank you, Dr. Lingus. In this next segment, I'll be singing 2 hymns I am working on from Kassia's 5 hymns for St. Christina. But first, I'll talk briefly about how I approached the music as an outsider to the tradition. Among the early sources, we have this 14th century Ambrosiana library manuscript that contains Kassia's hymns to St. Christina. Byzantine notation is different from Western staff notation. It feels more like dead reckoning. I follow the neumes above the text. I navigate by calculating my position in the melody in relation to the position I just left. The landmarks of a staff are unnecessary. To read the melody, I follow direction by direction, as if listening to the voice from Google Maps without taking the bird's eye view of the territory. To make sense of these neumes, I used the reference work that Dr. Lingus referred to of Middle Byzantine notation to chart a comparison of the manuscript with the only transcription initially available to me, that of Dr. Diane Touliatos. Creating this chart, neume by neume and syllable by syllable, did help me understand some of Touliatos's decisions, how the scholar mediates between the composer and scribe and the performer. Here is the modal signature for Kyrios Tetartos in the manuscript, which Touliatos indicates here as authentic mode 4. This modal signature requires us to intone the hymn with a formula, aia, Tuliatos writes the intonation as Our first syllable, tho, has the noum ison above it, which means we sing the same tone we just left at the end of the intonation. So, tho. The second syllable, xa, shows the noum combination of an ison plus petaste, which directs us to sing the same tone again, but with the dynamic energy of the petaste, which Tuliatos records as an accent. The third syllable, zo, gets an apostrophos, which means we go down a tone. Zo. The fourth syllable, men, is a noum combination of an oxia and an apostrophos, which means we go up a tone, then back down a tone. Plus, there's a klasma above the oxia, which indicates a lengthening. So you get and so on. I was delighted to locate the correspondences between the neumes and Tuliatos' transcription, but it wasn't yet singable. There were still so many symbols left encoded. We know the mode, but the implications aren't explained. There is no mention of an ison or drone, that single tone you so beautifully did under Hildegard, sustained under a chant that orients us in that mode. We cannot rely on the relative durations for a rhythm, as Dr. Lingus said. There is no key in Tuliatos' addition to interpreting her phonetic transcription of the hymn. Do the accents indicate an accent on the syllable, or a different way to pronounce the vowel? And likewise, there is no key in Tuliatos' addition to what these symbols above the music mean. The editor takes for granted that we already have knowledge of this tradition, at least enough to understand what remains encoded in order to interpret her transcription. But if we were already so familiar with the idiom of Byzantine chant, why would we be consulting a transcription in Western staff notation? I say this with great respect. After all, it is only because of Dr. Tuliatos' scholarship that I learned of Kassia at all. But to gain access to Kassia's hymns, there is more missing data to recover. Later, thanks to Dr. Lingus, I was able to see another transcription, this one by Dr. Yannis Arvanitis. Arvanitis provides a different phonetic transcription. For example, the initial consonant is written as DH, so we know something's going on there. Ornamental notes filled in between the melody's intervals. So with Tuliatos, we get su Christe. But that becomes in Arvanitis, su Christe. Arvanitis also writes Byzantine neumes above the notes for reference, so we have no need of our massive chart. And he also gives instructions for drones. You can see little tiny sol and re indicated there on the first line. Arvanitis departs from Tuliatos not only in ornamental interpretation, but also in the intervals of the melody itself, where Tuliatos went up a fourth at the word tyrannon, tyrant. Arvanitis ascends higher, up the whole octave. These are just two examples of how scholars might transcribe the early source. Though they differ, both adhere to the notation in the manuscript more closely than others. Many schools of Byzantine chant apply theories of the received tradition to create long, elaborated interpretations of the melody, and as Dr. Lingus said, would consider the manuscript melody as only a basic skeleton to be fleshed out later. Engaging with the early notation, at the very least, illuminates for performers just how much mediation we entrust to our transcriber editors and how much invention and creativity, along with research, is necessary to bring a medieval manuscript alive. It is the performer's burden and opportunity to search out tacit knowledge and source the unwritten conventions. The combined authority of all these informants, the manuscript itself, the scholar's transcriptions, along with my many teachers' expertise in paleography and performance practice, together make the hymns accessible to sing, which I will do for you now. Some cool things to listen for are in the first hymn. Notice how Kassia contrasts the word philanthrope, lover of humankind, with the word immediately following, tyrannon, the tyrant. And in the second hymn, keep an ear out for the high musical gesture on the phrase oplotou stavru, weapon of the cross.
In
And now we'll hear more from Dr. Lingus.
As I bring the sacred cable over. We'll have our own liturgies here. So what I would like to do now in my second part is place Kassia's compositional work within first its original liturgical context, and then note a little bit what has happened to it over the centuries, leaving a lot out, obviously. So I began by talking a little bit about East and West, just as Brett did, speaking of Gregorian chant and so on. But going back to late antiquity, that first of my periods, we had a kind of unity in ritual and linguistic diversity in the late Roman Empire with regard to Christian worship. Scholars of liturgy have pointed out that essentially in different parts of the Roman world, and also sometimes immediately outside it, we find regional traditions of worship, which they call rites in English, formed, and are usually around major population centers, the one exception being Jerusalem, which became important for other reasons, because it became a pilgrimage site. And these include places like Jerusalem, Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, Constantinople. I've got Jerusalem there twice, it's so important. Milan, the foundation of the Ambrosian tradition, and Spain, the tradition that's sometimes called Old Hispanic or Mozarabic. Now, the early history is something I will leave aside, but from those centers, two of them became particularly important in the Greek and, to a lesser extent, Syriac-speaking part of the Christian East. And those are the traditions of Jerusalem and Constantinople, which the liturgiologist Robert Taft called a tale of two cities that eventually became a tale of two deserts. So dealing with monastic and cathedral worship. And what's particularly important is the way that these two great centers of Christian worship in the Eastern Mediterranean started off with certain common principles of how to worship. They all had a version of the Eucharist, the communion service. They all had, for example, a cycle of daily prayer built around the Psalms. But the differences between them become important for the creation of what we now know as the Byzantine Rite, the kind of hybrid form of worship used by modern Eastern Orthodox and Greek Catholic Christians. So again, the two cathedrals in this case are the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, or Basilica of the Anastasis. It was a much larger complex in late antiquity than it is today, and Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. So the old rite of Hagia Sophia, its cycle of daily prayer, is used nowhere today in the Orthodox Church. There are bits and pieces of it, remnants that are around, and it stayed very archaic all the way to the end of the empire. It stopped being used, actually, at Hagia Sophia itself after 1204. 1204 is when the Fourth Crusade conquered Constantinople, and it was turned into a Roman Catholic cathedral, Hagia Sophia, between 1204 and 1261. And when it was recovered by the Eastern Roman Empire, they didn't bring back the old rite except for certain days. But what is remarkable about this old rite of Constantinople in terms of its daily prayer is that it was very archaic. The way that its psalms are structured and the way that we see the music that is set down in manuscripts as late as the 14th and 15th century match perfectly the descriptions of psalms and how they were sung in the great cities of antiquity as described by people like Ambrose in Milan, or the Spanish pilgrim Egeria, who visited Jerusalem around the beginning of the 5th century. For example, when I said about the question was the Psalms and how you use them, well, both Constantinople and Jerusalem used Psalm 140 at Vespers, at evening prayer. Why? Because its second verse says, "Let my prayer rise as incense in your sight, and let the lifting up of my hands be an evening sacrifice." So it's an appropriate psalm to sing at that part of the day. And in Constantinople, the way they did it was to sing the psalm verses with refrains, and the same refrain over and over and over, which is something that we have described in late antiquity. Now the psalm verse. And so on, for all the verses of the psalm, verse, refrain, which was great for late antiquity when you had large groups of people who'd come into the church and no hymnals in those days. So if you want to get them to participate, refrains is a way of doing it. So this is the sort of chant that Kassia would have heard if she went to her city's cathedral. However, Jerusalem quickly developed. It started off with something similar. Descriptions of liturgy in the 5th century in Jerusalem mention a system of psalms and refrains. But already it seems by the end of the 5th century, Jerusalem was enriching their traditions musically. They enriched them with new hymns, new texts, not just the same refrain every time, but different refrains that would change with each verse. And then a system of musical modes, the system of the 8 modes, the octoikos, to organize them. So even the same hymn, the same psalm verses might be heard in different musical modes each week. So whereas Constantinople embraced a kind of majestic dependability, shall we say, the Rite of Jerusalem promoted diversity in worship, in terms of lots of, or variety might be a better word. So And in some senses, this is very useful if you are trying to tell people what you're celebrating that day. One of the things about the rite of Hagia Sophia, like the rite of Old Rome, is that both of those rites have very little in the way of non-scriptural hymnography. So if you want to talk about the resurrection of Jesus, you generally do it using quotes from the Old Testament, from the Hebrew Scriptures. Because you're not... Whereas what Jerusalem did was they created new hymns to tell you precisely what you were singing about, and whole sets of them. So, for example, here's an example from the Good Friday morning prayer, and this is the Psalms of Lauds, the kind of morning counterpart of the lamp-lighting psalms, so Psalms 148 to 150, which are sung every morning. And as you sing through the verses, then you start adding sets of hymns, where the hymn might be heard just once or twice instead of being repeated as a refrain. And so this is one for Good Friday. So the psalm verse beforehand, and from 148, and then you have the 149 rather, and then this hymn, which is very much tells you that what you are doing is observing the crucifixion of Christ on Good Friday. All creation was changed by fear when it saw you hanging on the cross, O Christ. The sun was darkened. Very vivid poetry. And so here's an example of that. The first layer of these hymns from Jerusalem are anonymous, but then the habit gets picked up further and further abroad. And we eventually find by the 7th century poets attaching their names to these hymns, and they sometimes they are writing fully original hymns where they write the words and the music together. So if you've ever heard the term so-and-so is a melodist, so like St. Romanus the melodist. A melodist is someone who writes both the words and the melodies as a kind of whole. And also, though, because they wrote a lot of hymns, and you can only have so many original tunes to memorize, they also created some types of hymns that were based on a much smaller repertory of model melodies. So sing it to the tune of, and there might be, for some things, there might be a reference book giving that set of model melodies. And in other cases, they didn't even bother writing down the reference book because they were so well known. St. Romanus' Kontakion for Christmas actually became one of those model melodies, which is why it rarely got written down. So this became popular. It spread to Egypt. We find it already in use in Egypt before the Arab conquests. And it comes to Constantinople already in the 7th century. Some churches are starting to use Jerusalem hymns. So in the same city, different rites are being celebrated. Oops. By the time Kassia comes along, this Jerusalem style of worship is being fused with elements of the Constantinopolitan tradition. And that's essentially what you have if you go to a Greek or Russian or Antiochian Orthodox church today. What you are hearing is one particular synthesis between the traditions of Jerusalem and Constantinople. Essentially, to oversimplify, the sacraments, the communion, baptism, and so on are Constantinopolitan, and the cycle of divine services, daily prayer, is from Jerusalem. And poets throughout the empire, as far away as Sicily, start contributing to it. And we have emperors that wrote hymns for the rite of Jerusalem. The emperors adopted it for their own chapel in the imperial palace. So the imperial palace was right next to Hagia Sophia. So next to each other, again, two different rites being celebrated. And it seems even in some cases that the rite of Jerusalem was being celebrated, elements of it even in between the main services at Hagia Sophia. Also, there were monasteries, very influential monasteries, the monastery of St. John Studios in Constantinople, which had been one of the strong defenders of icons during this period of conflict over religious images. And its abbot, who seems to have been a mentor of Kassia, he himself wrote a lot of hymns. So this is the context into which Kassia emerges, a time when the rites of Constantinople and Jerusalem are fusing. And so we did a recording that was released with my ensemble Capella Romana, where we did some of her Christmas hymns, and setting them in their liturgical context, and also some of her hymns for Holy Week and the season of Lent. And so she's an example of someone who takes up this style. So she's in Constantinople writing hymns according to the rite of Jerusalem. So here's one of her ones for the warm-up to Lent, right before. So this is an example of one of her idiomala, a hymn which has its own melody, which was composed at the same time as she wrote the words. And I think you might have, if you followed the Greek along at all, there was a little bit of word painting where it says, when we fall down in abasement before you, that's when the melody reached its lowest point as well. So she's being very thoughtful in both her textual and her musical rhetoric. One of the things on this disc that we put down was a sequence of Christmas hymns. Only one of her Christmas hymns is in the current books, and that's an idiomalon. That's a hymn with its own tune, and it has stayed in the repertory when Augustus reigned. However, Kassia was writing at a time when the service books had not yet attained their modern form yet. And she wrote a whole series of hymns for Christmas to pre-existing melodies that only exist today in manuscript. They were never included in the service books of the Orthodox Church. So many of these hymns were written that it's now been whittled down to a mere 15 volumes of hymns that are in use, with about 50,000 individual hymns. So there were more. And so some of Kassia's did not make the cut. But one of the things was we reconstituted her original sequence for Christmas of hymns. So we did the lamplighting psalms. You've already heard Psalm 140 as it would have been sung in the tradition of Jerusalem at this time, which still used some refrains for the initial verses, except they used a much shorter refrain. In this case, it's just, "Hear me, O Lord, Isaku son mu Kyrie." And then there are her prosomia, things sung to similar melodies, contrafacta we would call them in Western terminology, and here's one of them. So psalm verse first. for the sake of time, we'll leave it there. It's a sequence of 4 to this tune, which is actually a Good Friday hymn. That's what it says, to the melody when you appeared, O Christ. So when you appeared, O Christ, on the cross is the Good Friday hymn. And she's then repurposed it, the melody for Christmas. There are 4 of these, and then there's another set of 3, not in the modern service books. There are also some cases of hymns where some of them are in the modern service books. She wrote a set of hymns for morning prayer on Holy Saturday, of which only the model stanzas are in the modern service books, and the stanzas that follow them were replaced by Mark of Otranto. There's even, among medieval authors, said that the palace didn't think it was proper to have, on such a solemn day, something by a woman being sung. So it says in the medieval sources. But be that as it may, but her whole text does exist, and even exists in Slavonic translation. So it made it as far as Jerusalem, and it made it as far as the Slavic world before falling out of use. So a little bit then looking at her posthumous, the posthumous fate of her works. Her music, that is, the things that she wrote with their own tunes, those idiomela, continued to be copied and periodically reworked through the centuries. On this disc that we did, the Hymns of Kassia, we showed the beginnings of this process by including a late Byzantine arrangement or recomposition of Kassia's hymn for Holy Wednesday in the so-called calophonic or beautiful-sounding style. The anonymous composer of this piece, and it's in a manuscript that's today on Mount Sinai, greatly expanded Kassia's music, nearly tripling its duration through textural repetitions, melismatic extensions of her melody, so it's taking vowels and pulling them way out, and even passages on vocables, ti-ri-ri, te-te-te, re-re-re, as well. So it's a fascinating work, but we don't have 20 minutes so to play it. So instead, I'm going to fast forward, though. Most reworkings of her chants occurred in the context of recodifications of the central repertories of Byzantine chant. It was very much, again, a living tradition that occasionally, as oral and written tradition would go out of phase a bit, or new artistic developments happen, it would get recodified. There was a light retouching in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, but in the post-Byzantine era, we had more extensive reworkings, and the last successful one of these occurred in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, and led the way to the introduction of the reformed new method of Byzantine chant notation. And so here you see the first publication of Kassia in the new notation when it was new. The new method really was new in 1820, published in Bucharest. And there's Kassia's hymn for Holy Wednesday, the hymn on the sinful woman, and it is there in the version of Petros Peloponnesios, who was a singer at the Patriarchate of Constantinople in the late 18th century. He was also a skilled Ottoman musician as well. Was known as Petri Kebir in Turkish. That's the tune you basically hear in most churches today. Petros also wrote a longer melody in that kind of extended style. The first word, once again. And that you will also hear. If choirs in Greece can pull it off, this is the one they do. There are many other versions out there as well. People have continued to do their adaptations of them. There are adaptations also in all the languages in which Byzantine chant is used, Arabic, Slavonic, and nowadays even English. Lord, the woman, and also an adaptation of the long one as well. So, Kassia in modern times has also made it into the realm of Western art music, starting with those parts of Greece that were more Italianate, the Ionian Islands, where they had the Venetians rather than the Ottomans, and down to contemporary composers like Christos Chadzis and Ivan Moody. Essentially, it's two hymns that keep getting set over and over: When Augustus Reigned from Christmas and the Holy Wednesday hymn on the Sinful Woman. So on the one hand, we have male chorus music in the style of, well, roughly Bellini, or Italian church music of the time. That was the English chamber choir being conducted by Guy Prothero. Nikolaos Manzaros is mainly known today as the composer of the Greek national anthem. Modern Greek-American composers have set for chorus and even organ. And then contemporary composers, for example, Father Ivan Moody, has set both When Augustus Reigned and the Troparion of Kassiani, the Troparion of Kassiani for women, actually, the Holy Wednesday hymn for Trio Medieval, originally. It's been performed by other people since. If I were to do an exhaustive treatment of her modern reception, it would take quite a while. So instead, I'd like to turn over to my colleague, who I believe is going to tell us about a new initiative as well to set Kassia's works.
Thank you, Dr. Lingus. In this final segment, I am excited to share with you both Kassia's most famous hymn, her Troparion for Holy Wednesday, and part of my virtual collaboration with contemporary Turkish composer Çiğdem Borucu. Çiğdem and I decided to focus on Kassia's hymn for Holy Wednesday about the sinful woman who wiped Christ's feet with her hair. Kassia lets the penitent speak for herself in this hymn. Accept the fountains of my tears, she says. Bow down to the groanings of my heart. My conversations with Chidem were full of imagining Kassia's creative process, from composing the hymn out loud in her own voice, to hearing her nuns sing it at her own religious community, to tweaking its rhetorical punch to best inspire worshipers, to knowing the hymns were eventually being sung in churches in her home city and far beyond. We also discussed the remarkable fact that these hymns are in our hands at all. Kassia's devotion, education, talent, and ambition aligned to preserve her contributions and an outline of her personality for posterity. You can see here on the right margin an attribution in the Ambrosiana manuscript source for her troparion for Holy Wednesday that reads, Kassia the monk. It is a special feeling to engage with the written texts of Kassia's works in light of the more common story of women marginalized, lacking opportunity and education, and generally erased from historical record. As I was charting the music, breaking it down neum by neum and the text word by word, Chidem was taken with the beauty of even smaller units, the syllables and phonemes. She created an introduction to Kassia's hymn for Holy Wednesday, which she called Imagining Kassia. She then built the piece from recorded samples of my voice, singing and speaking the first line of the hymn as I was learning it. While we listen to Imagining Kassia, I will be writing out the modal signature, the intonation formula, text, and musical notation of Kassia's first line. Chidem is thinking about Kassia's internal soundscape as she creates, and in that way is embodying the composer. I am typically concerned with embodying the performer, but there is another person in this chain of production, the scribe. Embodying the scribe is a different exercise in memory as well as mediation, another way to be in dialogue with Kassia's music. Another effect of the exercise is purely aesthetic. Graphics can exert a strong influence, and a habit of reading pristine, mechanically reproduced modern editions can make the seeming mess of the manuscript uncomfortable and something to be avoided. But how does the deceptively accessible transcription affect the singer's imagination? How might the Byzantine notation and Greek text intrigue us or improve us from the challenge? Sometimes reading off a transcription can feel like clicking print on a text document on the computer. Mimicking the hand of the scribe can feel more like an exercise in calligraphy. After Chidem's introductory piece, I will move right into Kassia's hymn for Holy Wednesday. As you follow along on the screens, I would suggest listening for Kassia's word painting on tous uranus, the heavens. You might recognize the high musical gesture, the very same thesis or formula, a combination of neumes, that she used to set the word stavru, cross, in the hymn we heard earlier. You will also hear many more intonations to establish or confirm modes in this hymn.
we'll have time for some Q&A.
So first of all, I enjoyed this presentation so much, and I just had a question to Brett. And you mentioned how there's a lot of room sometimes for interpretation in all different stages, but for you particularly as the performer. And I was wondering if you could just let us in a little bit more into that process. And I'm wondering if there are some decisions that you made that you maybe felt more certain that were truer to what might have been, versus other decisions that maybe you had a bit more artistic license. If there's any variation.
I am so new to this music that my typical habit would be to go to the text, but there's so much to learn about creating the music from the written source that I'm really relying heavily on, frankly, imitation of teachers right now. I could speak a little bit about that in the Hildegard. I feel like I had a breakthrough a couple months ago when I wondered why that poem had I couldn't figure out how to give a rhythm to it that made sense. And I read, I think Beverly Lomer, the same one who did the transcription, she wrote that the main subject of the hymn, divine love, caritas, is the whole point to be reiterated again and again through the poem. It abounds, it's everywhere, it's in all of us. So the vowels that are in that word, anytime they occur, even if they're unaccented in other words in the poem, I'm enjoying trying to emphasize those more. So that's one point of access. I guess I didn't discuss text at all tonight. I hope that answers your question.
We have a question from the Zoom audience. Dr. Sarah Bassett asks, you mentioned the possibility of using different modes for the same piece of music. Do you mean within the same composition or a wholly different mode from one performance to the next? And if it's the latter, what's your mechanism for deciding which mode and what is accomplished by the choice of mode?
All of the above is the answer. So the multiple modes can appear in the same composition. And the old treatises actually tell us that when you go up a step, you find the next mode. We're so used to thinking in octave scales ourselves, but if you are dealing with a system that is based on tetrachords, 1, 2, 3, 4, that set of intervals is repeated. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. The same exact set of melodic intervals is about, and one of the things that with the way these, actually this is, we can just take this piece here. So this piece is in the plagal fourth mode. It's a G, what we would call a G mode in the West, mode 8, if you want to do that type of thing. And it tells you the very first note of it gives you the intonation, yeah, that's the intonation for plagal 4. But then as we go through at some points, like right here, this is the intonation for mode 1. Up a step from plagal 4, from the G, we find mode 1. So we get a brief melodic formula that is associated with mode 1. And you actually then, Brett changed the ESON, because then it actually then goes down to cadences. It doesn't cadence in mode 1. But there are some pieces where you might have the whole phrase in mode 1, in which case then you would keep the drone going all the way through. Where are some other ones? If this was our yeah, this is na transposition at the fourth, which sometimes is also used for mode. What's mode? An F mode, but in transposition becomes a C mode. Na kata filiso tu sacra. To them it's a different mode. So you probably would need the, yeah. So that to them it's a different mode, and there are other places. That's the plagal first signature. and so anyway, basically, so yes, the same mode, multiple modes can be used in the same piece, even formula by formula. You can also have sort of truer modulations of somewhere a longer passage will be in another mode. Sometimes that mode can be done by even changing the relationships of the steps, in which case there's a special signs for that. They're called phthore, which means corruption. And you can corrupt the mode by introducing what we would call a different key, different sharps and flats. So all of those things. Now, the Jerusalem system allowed you, though, to sing the same text in different modes. So as part of the cycle, and basically the psalmody you'd sing it in different modes to match the hymns to which it was attached. But this is still true of today. So, for example, at the beginning of morning prayer, there's a response. The Lord is God and has appeared to us. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Theos Kyrios. Mode 1. Theos Kyrios ke pefanenimi nevlogimenos orchomenos enonomat Kyriou. Mode 2. Neanes Theos Kyrios ke pefanenimi nevlogimenos orcho, and so on. Na Theos Kyrios ke pefanenimi nevlogimenos orchomenos enonomat, and for mode 3, and so on. You go through the modes. So, so one of my party tricks when I was in university was to chant all lists of beers on tap in all 8 modes.
I thank you both for this so much, and really gorgeous singing, Brett, thank you. Actually, I'm glad you brought up the formulas because I had a question about those. Because those kind of formulas show up in medieval treatises in Europe also, in the 11th century. And I'm curious how those traveled such a long distance and maintained some of their integrity as melodic formulas.
Are you speaking specifically of the intonation formulas?
Well, yeah, like so you find in Guido, right? He says like the first one sounds like this, and it's no ane,
No ane, yeah.
The same syllables, right?
Yeah, no. I mean, Michel Huglot wrote all that up some time ago, and basically the Carolingian theorists, when they imported Roman chant from Rome, and we've got all the stories of how that worked or didn't work from people like John the Deacon and Notker Babulus and so on, but there was some attempt to send, because the chant of Rome itself, Old Roman chant, doesn't use the system of the 8 modes. And so when it went north and Charlemagne decided to adopt Roman chant, he was a Roman emperor now. I have to have a Roman chapel, that's why I built the chapel at Aachen, and I'm going to have Roman worship with Roman music. But also, he absorbed from the east the system of the 8 modes, borrowed it from Jerusalem, because the Rite of Constantinople doesn't really use it that much either. So the Carolingian theorists imported the whole kit and caboodle, along with a few hymns. I mean, there are a few hymns, some Epiphany hymns that Oliver Strunk studied some years ago. For those of you who know 15th century English polyphony, the Veterem Hominem Renovan Salvator, that's a translation of a hymn from the Rite of Jerusalem by Andrew of Crete, as Oliver Strunk pointed out. So some of these things did travel. So that was probably the last big influx of Eastern learning, but there were earlier ones. I mean, we find Romanus the Melodist translated into Latin via the rites of Milan and southern Italian rites, reworked into a responsory. So people were actually more in touch than we give them credit for. That's just one of the other issues that. Charlemagne gets crowned. The Franks invade Italy, or invited in, whatever, and he gets crowned Roman emperor by the Pope in 800. But that really annoyed the other Roman emperor, and who had territories on the Italian peninsula. The last East Roman garrison was thrown out by the Normans in 1071 from Bari. And up to the 13th century, the monastery of Grotta Ferrata in the hills outside Rome was one of the great scriptoria of Byzantine chant. Actually, Capella is about to come out with a volume of chants from Grotta Ferrata. So these people were more in touch as well. And then once the Westerners invaded the East with the Crusades, then they were side by side in other circumstances. But I think it's that they were in touch, and there was a deliberate attempt. This was part of Roman music, and East Roman modality was part of the project.
There's probably time for one more.
Should be shorter answers.
And another question about modes from the Zoom audience. Are there emotional associations with the different modes as in antiquity?
Yes, but not consistent. So there are a series of poems in the book of resurrectional hymns, there's an 8-week cycle of hymns in honor of the resurrection. And there are poems attached to each one of them that say something about, the ethos of them. But it's not consistent. However, we do find distinct choices of modes being made for particular liturgical celebrations. Easter is very much dominated by mode 1. Some of that may also be some number symbolism too. You start from there. The Feast of Epiphany has a lot of mode 2 in it. So there is something very much going on, and actually, if you read the church fathers, including later ones, going all the way to the 14th century, 15th century, they are still very much believers in the harmony of the spheres, and that music is a constitutive force of the universe, and that what you sing will change you.
Okay, that's our time. So join me again in thanking our speakers.